The Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado is one of those places that feels more like a story than a building. You've seen its white facade on postcards, its red roof shining against the Rockies. But if you listen closely, past the wind, past the tourists, past the gift shop chatter, the walls carry a very different sound. A sound that has been whispered about for over a century. Here's the part that history can't quite explain. In late October of 1974, the hotel was supposed to be empty. Closing for the season, its vast corridors had gone quiet. Yet that night, novelist Stephen King and his wife Tabitha walked through its hollow halls as the only guests. The dining room was deserted, but speakers still played a faint orchestral waltz. King swore the carpet stretched on forever, like a dream. And then, the nightmare came. He woke in a sweat after seeing his young son running down endless corridors, chased by something he couldn't describe. By morning, King had The Bones of the Shining in his head, his most enduring horror novel. A book that would later inspire one of the most haunted films in history. But here's the contradiction that locals whisper about. The Stanley insists it was closed. Official records say the dining room had no staff. The music system wasn't even supposed to be on. So who, or what, welcomed King that night? Quick pause. Before we go deeper into the Stanley's haunted story, I want to know, are you watching this alone at night, or in daylight like the brave ones do? Drop your answer in the comments. I love seeing how far these sleepless stories travel. Because this hotel is more than just a spooky backdrop for a novel. From its founding in 1909 by the inventor of the Stanley steamer, to its role as a tuberculosis retreat, to the tragedies that unfolded in its rooms, the Stanley has always been a stage where history and legend overlap. And yet, the real chills don't begin with Stephen King. Long before his typewriter clattered, guests and staff had already started to hear footsteps when no one was there, to feel cold fingers on their skin in warm rooms, to see lights flicker when the wiring was sound. Tonight, I want to take you back into that hotel. Room by room, hallway by hallway, following the stories that turned the Stanley into one of America's most haunted hotels. Because before King dreamed of a boy and his shadowed pursuer, a different story had already burned itself into the hotel's bones. It happened in a single room, room 217. And what unfolded there changed the Stanley forever. So let me ask you before we open that door, have you ever heard a story so frightening it made someone quit their job on the spot? Long before ghost hunters set up cameras in its empty hallways, the Stanley Hotel was built as a promise of life. In 1903, Freeland Oscar Stanley, better known as F.O. Stanley, the co-inventor of the Stanley steamer automobile, arrived in Colorado with a diagnosis that felt like a death sentence. Tuberculosis. Doctors told him he might not last the year. But Estes Park changed everything. The crisp mountain air, high elevation, and long summers gave him strength. His health began to return. And with it came an obsession. If this valley could save his life, why not build something here that could outlast him? By 1909, the Stanley Hotel opened its doors. It wasn't built like the log cabin retreats scattered through Colorado at the time. No, this was elegance imported from the East Coast. A sprawling white colonial revival building, red roof gleaming in the sun, verandas stretching outward like arms welcoming visitors. Imagine it. The scent of pine carried on cool breezes, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel, the glow of gaslights warming the lobby. The Stanley wasn't just a hotel. It was a retreat for the wealthy, a place where Boston and New York elites could escape the summer heat. It had electricity before the town of Estes Park did. Telephones in every room. Even a fleet of Stanley steamers waiting to drive guests up the mountain roads in polished style. For a while, it was called the playground of the rich. But as grand as it was, F.O. Stanley's vision came with shadows. The hotel was also a haven for tuberculosis patients, men and women who came chasing the same thin air that had healed him. Not all left Estes Park alive. Some guests checked into the Stanley and never checked out. Their names have faded from the registers, but their presence, some say, lingers. And in its very first decade, the Stanley developed an unsettling reputation. Staff whispered of footsteps echoing down corridors after midnight, when every door was locked. Guests claimed to hear distant piano music from the empty concert hall. And though F.O. Stanley lived to see his grand hotel thrive, locals began to talk. It was as if the building itself was watching, listening. The Stanley Hotel had been born from a fight against death. But as it stood tall against the Rockies, death seemed to find its way inside anyway. And the strangest thing? The stories didn't begin in the ballroom or the lobby. They began in the service wing, where a single, violent accident turned an ordinary guest room into a legend. Every haunted hotel has a room that becomes its heartbeat. At the Stanley, that room is 217. The year was 1911. Estes Park had been growing, and with it the demands of a luxury hotel that boasted electric lighting in every suite. But mountain storms had a way of cutting power, and when the electricity failed, the Stanley turned to gas lamps for light. On a June night, a chambermaid named Elizabeth Wilson, Lizzie, to some of her friends, entered room 217 with a lit match to check the lamps. She didn't know that gas had been leaking silently into the room. The explosion was violent. It tore through the suite, shattered windows, and hurled Wilson through the floor into the dining room below. Newspapers reported the incident, and guests whispered about the screams. But here's the eerie part: Elizabeth survived. Badly injured, yes, but she lived. And according to hotel records, she eventually returned to work. Imagine that, walking back into the very room that had nearly killed you, day after day, with the same crisp uniform and steady hands. It's here that history and folklore blur. Some stories insist Elizabeth died that night, her spirit bound forever to room 217. Others say she worked at the Stanley until her passing decades later, only to return as a ghost. What most visitors agree on is that the room has never been ordinary since. Guests who stay in room 217 tell of lights flickering on their own, of luggage mysteriously unpacked, of folded clothes laid out neatly as if a maid had passed through. Couples report a cold pressure sliding between them in bed, as though someone disapproved of their closeness. And in the quietest hours, a faint smell of gas drifts through the suite, even when no lines are active. The Stanley itself leans into the legend. Today, room 217 is their most requested suite, a place where history and haunting are sold together. And every night someone new tests their luck, lying in the bed where Elizabeth once hovered between life and death. But the Stanley's strangeness wasn't limited to one room. Even in those early years, the hotel's cavernous hallways seemed to breathe. Staff swore the fourth floor echoed with the sound of children running and laughing long after families had checked out. And in the concert hall, notes of a piano would drift across the room with no one at the keys. One accident gave the Stanley a ghost story to anchor its reputation. But the building itself seemed to hunger for more. The strange sounds were multiplying. The rooms were restless. And soon, the hauntings would stretch beyond a single maid story, wrapping themselves around the very guests who came seeking peace. By the 1920s, the Stanley Hotel had settled into its rhythm as the crown jewel of Estes Park. Wealthy visitors from the East Coast rolled up the mountain roads in gleaming Stanley steamers, greeted by white-gloved porters and the soft glow of chandeliers. In the daylight, the building was dazzling, porches full of laughter, orchestras filling the air, and elegant dances beneath glittering light. But when night fell, the glamour began to fracture. The concert hall was one of the hotel's most celebrated spaces. Designed for music and laughter, it quickly became a place where echoes never seemed to fade. Staff closing the hall after midnight claimed they would hear the faint, deliberate notes of a piano. The sound was unmistakable, the weight of keys pressed by unseen fingers, each note ringing out into the empty air. Some believed it was Flora Stanley, F.O.'s wife, who had adored the piano in life and never quite let go of it in death. Then there was the billiards room, where F.O. himself once entertained friends and investors. Guests who wandered in after hours have reported catching glimpses of a man in period dress, leaning against the pool table as though waiting for a game. Sometimes, the scent of pipe tobacco fills the air, though smoking has long been banned inside the hotel. And the fourth floor? That's where the stories grow darker. Once a space where children and nannies stayed in the early days, its hallways are said to carry the energy of restless youth. Guests lying awake in the small hours often hear the patter of tiny feet running just outside their door. Some have sworn they heard giggles, others a bouncing ball, rolling down the hallway where no child is in sight. One guest even complained that children kept knocking on their door, only for staff to confirm no families had been booked on that floor at all. It was during these golden years that the Stanley began developing a reputation, not just for its luxury, but for something stranger. Locals told newcomers to mind the quiet hours, when the building itself seemed to stir. Travelers wrote about strange sounds in letters home. And for every glamorous evening of music and champagne, there were whispered mornings when guests checked out early, pale and uneasy, unwilling to say exactly what had unsettled them. The Stanley Hotel was alive with wealth and splendor. But beneath the surface, it was already becoming something else entirely, a structure that collected memories, voices, and perhaps even souls. And though its corridors had long been restless, it wasn't until a famous visitor in the 1970s that the world truly took notice. One quiet October night, the Stanley welcomed a man whose dreams would turn the hotel into the most famous haunted house in America. By the mid-1970s, the Stanley Hotel had seen its golden age fade. The rich families no longer flocked to Estes Park the way they once did, and the grand white building stood mostly as a relic, beautiful, yes, but tired, its long halls often half-empty. It was into this hollow silence that Stephen King arrived in October of 1974. King was not yet the global name we know today. He had one breakout novel, Carrie, but was searching for his next story. He and his wife Tabitha were traveling through Colorado when they heard about a mountain hotel closing for the season. They checked in, the only guests. Picture it, endless empty corridors, patterned carpet stretching into shadow, the faint hum of wind pressing against the old windows. The dining room was deserted, but somehow, canned orchestra music still played through the speakers, as if ghosts were hosting a ball only they could see. Bartenders had gone home, staff were gone, and yet the atmosphere felt strangely alive. That night King had a dream. In it, his young son ran down the hotel's endless hallways, chased by a figure he couldn't name but knew to be terrible. King woke in a sweat, lit a cigarette, and by the time the match had burned down, the skeleton of The Shining was in his head. By dawn, the Stanley was no longer just a hotel. It was the Overlook. But here's where fact and mystery collide. The Stanley insists the hotel had been fully closed, no staff, no service, no music playing. Yet King swore he heard it. He described those endless corridors, the sense of being watched, the feeling that something was breathing just behind him. It's as though the building itself opened a door for him, letting him glimpse what countless guests had already felt. From that night forward, the Stanley Hotel would never shake its connection to The Shining. Tourists came not just for the mountain air, but for the chance to walk the same hallways where a nightmare was born. And the hotel, which had been fading, was suddenly alive again, fed by fear. But King's dream wasn't the only shadow in the Stanley story. The rooms were already restless. Room 217 had its secrets, the fourth floor its children, the concert hall its piano. And in the decades to come, countless others would bring cameras and courage to test what King first felt. The Stanley was no longer just a retreat. It had become a legend. He wrote The Shining as fiction. But some who visit the Stanley swear the story was already true. He saw his son running through the hallways that night. But what he didn't tell the world was what he saw when the boy stopped running. And that ended his sleep forever. So tell me, have you ever had a dream so vivid it felt like a memory? Drop your story in the comments. After Stephen King's visit, the Stanley Hotel was never just a hotel again. The world knew it as the Overlook, but for those who dared to stay, it was something more unsettling, a living museum of paranormal activity. The reports began to stack up. Guests would check in expecting nothing more than a thrill from The Shining, but by morning, they were whispering about what they saw, or swearing never to return. In the lobby, a panoramic photograph captured national attention. A family posed happily on the grand staircase. When the film was developed, there was someone else in the frame. A faint figure stood behind them, white blouse, dark skirt, no face. Photographers analyzed it, skeptics called it a trick of light, but many swore the image revealed one of the Stanley's lingering spirits. The story went viral, pulling even more curious travelers through the front doors. The hotel staff have their own tales. On quiet nights, employees in the concert hall have heard heavy footsteps pacing the stage, only to find it empty. In the ballroom, chandeliers sway when the air is still. Doors lock themselves. Billiard balls roll from one side of the table to the other, as if someone invisible still waits for a match. And then, there's room 217, always room 217. Guests tell of waking to find their suitcases unpacked, their clothes folded neatly by unseen hands. Some have even reported feeling tucked into bed, as though a long-dead chambermaid still checks on her guests. Others claim a rush of icy air sweeps through the suite at random, leaving them shivering in the dark. Skeptics suggest drafts, bad wiring, or the power of suggestion. But how do you explain the stories from guests who checked in without ever knowing the hotel's reputation? Families who heard children laughing in the hallway when no other families were booked. Couples who woke to the sound of a woman's sigh drifting across the room, when no one else was there. The Stanley thrives on these accounts. Paranormal investigators bring night vision cameras and audio recorders, prowling the hallways in search of proof. And while skeptics leave with excuses, others leave with recordings they can't explain, soft voices caught on tape, whispers that answer questions, shadows moving just beyond the lens. The longer the hotel stands, the more voices it seems to collect. And the question remains, are the spirits restless, or is the Stanley itself alive, feeding on the attention we give it? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain, the Stanley doesn't let go of its stories. And no story is more infamous than the suite that made Stephen King shiver. But what most people forget is that the number 217 belongs to the novel, not the film. And the truth of why Hollywood changed it reveals another layer of mystery. Room 217. Say it aloud, and most ghost enthusiasts know exactly what it means. The site of the 1911 explosion, the restless chambermaid, the chilling energy that still lingers. It's the room Stephen King slept near when The Shining first appeared in his mind, and it remains the crown jewel of the hotel's haunted reputation. But when Stanley Kubrick adapted King's novel for film, something strange happened. Room 217 became Room 237. Why the change? There are a few versions of the story. Some claim Kubrick wanted to avoid upsetting the Timberline Lodge in Oregon, which served as a model for the film's exterior shots. They had a real Room 217, and the hotel management politely requested it not be associated with murder and terror. Others say Kubrick simply liked the number 237. Whatever the reason, the cinematic Room 237 became inseparable from the story, leaving Room 217 in the Stanley Hotel as a curious footnote in pop culture history. And yet, visitors to Room 217 report the same phenomena King himself described decades ago. Lights flicker inexplicably. Guests feel cold fingers brush across their skin. Sometimes, faint music drifts down the hallway, as if someone is practicing scales in a room long abandoned. Photographs taken inside occasionally show strange orbs or shadows, even when the room was empty. It's a place where fact and folklore intersect. The 1911 explosion, the real Elizabeth Wilson, the modern staff accounts, they all converge into a single energy that the Stanley calls Room 217. Visitors can feel it without seeing it. Some leave with smiles, exhilarated by the thrill. Others exit pale, unable to explain the tightness in their chest or the whisper that seemed to call their name. Room 217 is a reminder that the Stanley Hotel's hauntings are not just stories. They are experiences. They are encounters that persist across decades, sometimes subtle, sometimes undeniable. And while Kubrick's Room 237 captured the imagination of millions, the original room remains an anchor for those who chase true paranormal encounters. Tonight, we follow the trail left by these restless energies. Investigators, both professional and amateur, descend upon the Stanley in search of proof. Cameras flash, recorders capture the faintest sighs, and the building hums with a quiet, patient intelligence. And what they find, or think they find, sometimes leaves them questioning reality itself. As the legend of the Stanley Hotel grew, so did curiosity. It wasn't enough to read about Stephen King's experience, or to peek at ghost photos online. People wanted proof. Paranormal investigators, armed with cameras, EMF meters, and audio recorders, began to descend on Estes Park, hoping to capture the unexplained. The investigators tell similar stories. In the ballroom, cameras sometimes catch orbs of light drifting against the chandeliers. Recorders pick up faint murmurs in the hallways when no one is there. In room 217, some have captured icy bursts of air on thermal cameras, or objects subtly shifting as if moved by unseen hands. The most cautious teams describe a watching presence, a sensation of being observed, even when alone. But skeptics have their explanations. Electrical faults, drafts from the mountain air, and the power of suggestion are often cited. Some argue that visitors expect to feel fear, so their minds create experiences to match. Optical illusions and long exposure photography can turn shadows into ghostly figures. The so-called orbs in photographs are often just dust particles reflecting light. And yet, not every account fits neatly into skepticism. Guests with no knowledge of the Stanley's lore report seeing apparitions or hearing footsteps. Employees working the night shift speak of experiences that leave them uneasy for days. Even investigators who enter with a purely scientific mindset sometimes leave questioning what they thought they knew. One widely cited case involved a family staying in room 217. They had no knowledge of the hotel's ghost stories and woke at 3 a.m. to find the room unnervingly cold, with the bed covers folded neatly beside them. Cameras recorded a subtle movement in the corner of the room, but no one was visible. Skeptics called it a coincidence. Believers called it Elizabeth Wilson checking in once more. Investigations continue to this day. The Stanley welcomes researchers, tourists, and curious thrill-seekers alike, each hoping to glimpse what lies beyond ordinary perception. The building seems to respond differently to every visitor, its energy subtle or intense depending on who is listening, who is watching, who is believing. For some, the Stanley Hotel is the perfect place to test the boundaries between reality and the unexplained. For others, it's a house that remembers and waits. And as long as cameras flash and lights flicker, the investigations will never end. Because sometimes, when the last guest leaves, the evidence left behind isn't a photo, a recording, or a note. It's a whisper in the hallway, a creak in the floorboards, and the undeniable feeling that the Stanley Hotel is still very much alive. The Stanley Hotel isn't just haunted by history, it's haunted by the people who have lived, worked, and lingered within its walls. Their stories are subtle, sometimes fleeting, yet impossible to ignore. Staff members recount footsteps echoing through empty corridors long after the last guest has checked out. One night, a housekeeper reported hearing the soft squeak of a cart rolling down the hallway. When she opened the door, the hall was empty, the carpet undisturbed. She insists the sound was deliberate, almost patient, as if someone, or something, was waiting for her attention. Guests have similar accounts. A couple visiting room 217 described waking to find their luggage unpacked and clothes neatly folded, despite no one having entered the room. One guest claimed to see a shadowed figure at the foot of their bed, watching silently, only to vanish when a beam of light from the hallway fell across the mattress. Others have heard faint piano music in the concert hall at 2 a.m., or whispers calling their name while they walk the fourth-floor corridors. Archivists at the Estes Park Museum speak of a different kind of haunting. They've examined old registers, letters, and photographs from the hotel's early years. Some images show figures appearing unexpectedly, guests who weren't listed in the records, or shadows where no one should be. Curators admit a chill runs through them when they handle certain artifacts, particularly those connected to room 217 and the early 1900s. Even those who enter skeptically often change their minds. A reporter from Condé Nast Traveler recalled walking down the hallway near the billiards room, hearing a soft cough behind her. She turned, nothing. But the feeling of being observed lingered long after she left. "I went to write it off as nerves," she said, "until the photographs from that night revealed something I can't explain." The voices of the Stanley are everywhere, yet they are never direct. They are in a door that clicks shut without wind, a floorboard that groans under invisible weight, the sudden chill that creeps along your spine. And the stories persist because the hotel encourages them. It knows that every visitor, every guest, every staff member carries with them the perfect medium for a haunting belief. These testimonies remind us that the Stanley Hotel is more than wood and stone. It is a collection of experiences, layered upon one another, each imprinting a memory that refuses to fade. And as the nights stretch on, those memories begin to whisper to the next visitor, daring them to listen. For some, the Stanley offers charm and nostalgia. For others, it offers the kind of fear that lingers long after the lights go out. And as you listen to these voices tonight, ask yourself, how many of them might still be wandering the halls, waiting for someone new to notice? The Stanley Hotel is a building that remembers. Not in the way walls remember the weight of beams or the scent of varnish, but in the way objects carry echoes of the past, moments, feelings, even spirits. Every photograph, every piano key, every register entry seems to hold a trace of those who came before. Take the grand piano in the concert hall. It sits there as if waiting for a hand to coax its strings, yet on quiet nights, the notes emerge without any visible player. Staff have sworn that the melody shifts depending on who is present, sometimes gentle and inviting, other times discordant and unnerving. One investigator, recording overnight, captured the piano playing a single, slow chord before cutting off abruptly, as if someone had pressed the keys and vanished. Guest registers are another form of lingering evidence. Pages from the early 1900s show names of visitors who vanished from other records, guests who left no trace of their stay but whose names remain inked in time. Some modern guests have discovered unexplained signatures beside theirs, written in handwriting that does not match their own, as though the hotel itself had inscribed its approval or warning. The famous panoramic photograph in the lobby also continues to intrigue. A family once posed on the grand staircase, smiling at the camera. When the photo developed, a faint, shadowy figure appeared behind them. Staff say it wasn't the photographer's assistant. Skeptics call it a trick of lighting, but believers see Elizabeth Wilson standing in the frame, watching silently as generations of guests come and go. And then there is the hedge maze outside. A favorite of tourists during the day, at night it transforms. Some claim to hear whispers between the hedges, footsteps circling them in the darkness, or glimpses of shadowy figures vanishing when approached. It's a living artifact, a structure shaped not just by human hands, but by memory and fear itself. Visitors continue to bring new evidence. Recorders capture footsteps when hallways are empty, cameras catch fleeting silhouettes, and some claim that objects move when no one is watching. Even those who don't believe find themselves hesitant to spend the night alone in certain rooms. The artifacts, the piano, the registers, the photographs, the maze, are not silent. They hold history, tragedy, and energy that cannot be measured. And for every piece of evidence captured, there are dozens more experiences that vanish before they can be recorded, leaving only the lingering sense that the Stanley is aware. And tonight, in room 217, something waits. A guest once opened the door to find the suite as it had been decades ago. The gas lamps lit, the bed perfectly made, a faint scent of flowers in the air. He stepped inside, and the door slammed behind him. He turned to leave, and saw a shadow in the corner. Before I tell you what happened next, I have to ask, have you ever felt something move in your room when you were completely alone? Tell me below. The Stanley Hotel is more than a building. It is a memory, a ghost story stitched into the mountainside, a living archive of the people who have passed through. From its birth in 1909 by F.O. Stanley, to the near death of Elizabeth Wilson in room 217, to the night Stephen King dreamed the Overlook into existence, the hotel has always been a crossroads of life, death, and something that exists between. Culturally, the Stanley has become an icon. Tourists from around the world visit not just for luxury or history, but to confront the uncanny. It inspired The Shining, shaping the modern imagination of haunted hotels. It has been featured in documentaries, YouTube investigations, and countless books about paranormal phenomena. Photographers and filmmakers attempt to capture its spectral energy, while skeptics continue to argue its hauntings are mere legend. Yet the stories endure unbroken. The piano continues to play in empty halls. Room 217 continues to chill the night air. Shadows still linger near the grand staircase, whispering through the corridors. Even modern renovations have not erased the traces of the past. The hotel seems to absorb every memory, folding them into its essence. Psychologically, the Stanley occupies a unique space. It challenges what we believe about the unseen. The building exists at the intersection of history and myth, leaving visitors wondering whether the strange occurrences are supernatural, or whether the weight of a century of stories is enough to create something real, unseen yet undeniably present. For those who have walked its halls at midnight, the hotel leaves a mark. It is a reminder that some places are alive in ways that cannot be measured. Some rooms remember us. Some walls listen. Some stories are not just told, they are felt. And so, as the wind whistles down the mountainside and the shadows lengthen across the Stanley's white facade, we are left with the question that every visitor, investigator, and dreamer must face. If you ever had to spend a night there, would you keep the lights off, or would you run? The Stanley Hotel doesn't care which answer you choose. It will wait for you either way.